Welcome to In the Middle, a podcast on Christianity in the Middle East, where we explore questions of history, religion, culture, and policy that affects the ancient and indigenous Christian communities of the Middle East. I'm honored to be joined today by Bishop Gregory Mansour of the Maronite Catholic Eparchy of St. Maron in Brooklyn, New York, and Ambassador Edward Gabriel, President of the American Task Force on Lebanon, to discuss Lebanon's unique character, its Christian heritage, and the challenges it faced historically and continues to face. So, without further ado, thanks for joining the conversation, and welcome to In the Middle. Bishop Gregory, Ambassador Gabriel, welcome, and thanks for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich.
Good to be with you, Rich. And Bishop.
So many of our listeners are somewhat aware with Lebanon if they're watching the news in any capacity or following current events in any capacity. They are aware of the challenges Lebanon is facing, but also its history of prosperity and its unique place in the region. Before we begin the substance of the conversation, I'd like to throw the question out there. What is Lebanon? We know it's more than a country. It's a project. It's a message. We've heard it referred to in many ways. But from your perspectives, what makes it unique and why does it matter? Ambassador Gabriel, I'll go ahead and invite you to start off.
So, Lebanon is very unique. One, its location is very unique. Historically, it's been a crossroads of all religions. And as you know, it's been referred to as the Paris of the Middle East, the Switzerland of the Middle East. I should say to you, in 1963, it was the fourth wealthiest country in the world. So it really stood out in the world as a place where it was a crossroads where people would come, assemble, get to know one another, and feel comfortable in multicultural, multi-religious area. So I would say that is generally how I would describe this very beautiful, mountainous country of Lebanon.
Thank you for that, Ambassador. Bishop Gregory, we've heard many times Pope John Paul, St. John Paul II's reference to Lebanon as a message to East and West. Could you elaborate a little bit more about what?
Yes, full disclosure, both Ed and Ambassador Ed and Gabriel and myself, we have very strong and very proud Lebanese roots. So for those listeners out there, but it's not just personal for either the ambassador or myself. It's the meaning of the country. As the ambassador mentioned, it is at a crossroads. It is more than just a country. And so Pope John Paul II quoted, we quote him often, Lebanon is more than a country, it's a message. So if I can give just a little bit of history to Lebanon. So if we can go back to 1919, when a 76-year-old Maronite patriarch made his way to Versailles, France, and to the Paris Peace Conference, and urging the Allied leaders to carve out of Syria a portion that would be Lebanon. And that portion of Lebanon didn't include just the Maronites in the north, but include the Sunnis and the Shiites and the Druze. And as the ambassador said, it is a multi-confessional, a multi-religious, pluralistic place. And that's what makes the magic of Lebanon so beautiful. It's Muslim-Christian conviviality. And that's what we don't want to lose.
That's wonderful, and that's very much a part of Lebanon's DNA, as you suggest. It goes back a century, and even before that, I had the pleasure of talking to Aram Hamparian yesterday, who is, of course, from the Armenian National Committee of America. We were talking on this podcast about Armenia and the history of Armenia, and an interesting part of the conversation that we had revolved around this idea of founding myths or origin stories. You know, we think of Israel and the Jewish people. We think of Abraham and his faithfulness to God and obedience to God. We think of Moses in the Exodus and the history of trial for the Jewish people. In the American context, we think of Paul Revere's famous ride the Boston Tea Party that communicates this idea of American independence and the Lockean philosophy of the sovereignty of the individual. In the case of Lebanon, I would love to know, is there a discrete or identifiable founding myth there that from which we derive philosophies and principles upon which Lebanon is founded?
So, Rich and the ambassador, I'll try to take that question. I would say it's religious freedom. That is and that's interesting because it's very much the origin story of America, a search for religious freedom, from the Puritans to all the other religious communities that came to the United States. They did not want to be ruled by a king from overseas. They didn't want to be a colony. They wanted a new story to be told. And I think, interestingly enough, 100 years ago, when the Maronite patriarch came to Versailles, he wanted something new. But interestingly enough, his experience with Muslims, especially the Ottoman Turks, was terrible. Terrible. Deadly. But he intentionally included in his vision the Muslim people of Lebanon and built bridges towards them and said to them basically, we can start something new. So the founding, the origin stories of Lebanon are of Christians and Muslims who dreamed of a place in which a Muslim can live his faith without persecution, and a Christian can live his faith without persecution, and that neither Muslim or Christian would dominate, but there would be a pact, an agreement, and that agreement was kind of detailed, unwritten, in the 1940s when the Maronite community would put forth the president, the Sunni community would put forth a prime minister, and the Shiite community would put forth a Speaker of the House. And that's still till today. That is the amazing conviviality of Lebanon. It's not perfect. There's no consensual democracy that is perfect, but it has worked until today.
You put your finger on something very interesting and relevant, Bishop Gregory, is this idea of confessionalism, the reservation of the various positions of power for the various religious communities. Ambassador Gabriel, in the 80 or even let's say 80-year history since the founding of that constitutional model of confessionalism, how have you seen it work in previous decades, and where do you see the future of confessionalism in Lebanon, for better or worse?
Well, unfortunately, it's been a struggle, hasn't it? I think until 1956, 58, it seemed to have been working, but there's been turmoil ever since, and so there's a struggle, I think, today between, a compact among the various religious heads to find some kind of equality in running and ruling Lebanon, which I think is very important in terms of making sure that all factions, all confessions in Lebanon have an equal say, versus, one person, one vote, and really bringing about a true democratic process. The problem is there hasn't been a census in Lebanon for over 70 years, I guess. And in that sense, the question will be, how do you disperse, the religious mix between in the parliament, and how does that translate into a government? So we have to be careful there, because right now there's an understanding that those religions all have to be represented in some way and find a way forward. It's not working so well in recent years, but to move all the way to a democratic process might also not be good for the various religions. And so it's an ongoing discussion. which brings us to present day. Do you have a discussion about a new constitution, which groups who think they're maybe in the majority of would like, versus do we fully enact the Taif Accords from 1990, and does that help us basically bring more equality among the religious sects? So it's a tough question in front of us, Bishop.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador. I'd like to piggyback on that, just to add to the confusion for the common folk. There is approximately 1.5 million Palestinian refugees. I'm not sure of that number. Maybe there could be more in different refugee settlements within Lebanon. And then there's about 2 million Syrian refugees. So Lebanon is a fragile democracy, a fragile consensual democracy, and it's not easy to govern. But I believe in the confessional system within the Maronites and Christians in general, and the Sunni and Shiite, if each group puts forth good people to govern, Lebanon can work. Or if bad people are put forward to govern, Lebanon can be harmed. And so that's really the issue right now is Lebanon is looking for really some good people in all the confessions to step forward and to uh, um, realize the vision of its founders.
May I jump in, Rich, and just add to that what the bishop said? He said good people versus bad. Let me put a fine point on that. I really think there are plenty of good people that are competent in Lebanon. It's one of the most remarkable educated people on the face of the earth. They really know their business. The real problem is that we've got a very corrupt system and a corrupt group of elites running the country. And you also have a state within a state through Hezbollah. So the question is, how do you deal with Hezbollah on the one hand? And it may in fact be part of the fabric of Lebanon. We've heard that time and time again. Well, if they're going to be part of the fabric of Lebanon, they're going to have to put down their arms and act like they are a part of rather than distinct from. And then secondly, you've got to deal with the issue of corruption. So I think in dealing with those two things, I agree with the bishop. There's a chance the confessional system could work. It needs some fine tuning. There is some, as the patriarch calls for, maybe some fine tuning through the definition of the Taif Accords and what it meant. But it could work with those two caveats, I think.
Excellent points, both. Thank you for that. You mentioned the active role and the nefarious role, destructive role of Hezbollah in Lebanon. And in order to be part of the fabric and the conversation in any legitimate way, they would first need to put their arms down and comply with numerous UN resolutions. And that certainly is agreeable on all sides. Well, on all sides in this conversation, anyhow, not universally, unfortunately. The question is that I would have is Hezbollah. Its place of power, its position of power, is derived from a couple places, of course. One, its weapons, as you mentioned, and the second source of its so-called legitimacy, I would say, is their narrative, right? The narrative as the sole defender against the great evil to the south, Israel, and in general, the sole defender of Lebanese sovereignty, which we can agree here is a bogus narrative. What is the best way, in your opinion, both Ambassador and as well as Bishop Gregory, to attack this narrative or to get it at its foundation?
If I might go. So, just to send a little compliment to the ambassador and the work of the American Task Force in Lebanon, I know that they pushed hard so that America would continue the work for the maritime boundary, and that was really an important. And I'm proud of President Aoun for signing that. Um, that was a very good move for the part of Lebanon. If we could also do a land uh, um, boundary, then we don't need Hezbollah's stories. Um, we don't need them. We don't need to hate anybody. I mean, is there any? That's what the Patriarch Rai said very beautifully a while back. Um, we Christians, we don't have to have any enemies. We don't need to have enemies. Neither Iran, nor Saudi Arabia, nor America, nor Israel. We don't need enemies. Life is too short. So I think the narrative of Hezbollah about the enemy to the south is a lot of bluster for no good reason. And I think that certainly can be surmounted as was the maritime border. So that's my hope.
May I add to that, Rich, and the bishop? So, another element in this is Iran. So let's not forget their influence in terms of their terrorist proxies in the region, i.e., Hezbollah's regional menace and their internal menace inside Lebanon. So part of this has to come down to how we engage Iran and how the United States engages Iran, and what if we're going to cut a deal with them down the road, and I don't see it happening anytime soon, but if we're going to cut a deal with them, will they not only deal with the nuclear question, which is so important to America and the world, no question about it, but also can they deal with missile technology and terrorist proxies? So I would add that. I'd also agree with the bishop that if you can take the maritime border and extend it to other small things like the land border, you help diffuse the situation in the south. And to the extent that Hezbollah claims credit for having helped create that situation, okay, let them try to take some credit for it. Who cares? As long as there is peace and security on the border. So that's another move in the right direction. The third thing I'd put out there, though, is diplomacy and dialogue. I've been having a dialogue with the principal Shia imam in Lebanon. It's been a very interesting conversation. We've talked about Hezbollah arms, and we talked about whether or not he could foresee a day when they would put down their arms, to make Bishop Gregory's point. And he acknowledged that there is a point at which they should put down their arms. And the last time I met with him, we actually talked about the maritime deal. And of course, they take more credit than they should, but they're taking some credit for cutting this deal, or at least creating the fear in order to want to conclude the deal. And I said, do you think there'll ever be a time when Hezbollah can make a contribution like happened with the maritime border without being so threatening? Can they do something that is positive and is part of the fabric of Lebanon as a decision maker, moving the country forward? And so I think the dialogue's good. I think, we've got to continue to press that case. And the final point I would make is America has to stick by its guns. America has to make sure that nobody gets money to bail out this country that's corrupt. And that the pressure has to be on this country to support the Lebanese people, which means reforms. And in that sense, I think the people get stronger and militias get weaker. The last point I'd make is the stronger the Lebanese armed forces are, the better the country is, because there should only be one armed force protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Lebanon.
Thank you for that. That was really a wonderful answer to a very complex question, in fact, multifaceted. To expand it just a bit, we talked, quite great length, I'd say, about the security risk and the security problem affecting Lebanon, namely Iran and Hezbollah. Pulling back a little bit more, we know that there's more than a security problem. There's a political corruption problem, which essentially contributes to and creates this humanitarian problem that we witness in Lebanon that's been so damaging to so many of all religions in Lebanon. What is the best way, Ambassador Gabriel, to address this humanitarian crisis and, as you said, not wanting to avoid bailing out a corrupt government, right? Not wanting to feed and enable a corrupt government. So what's the best way to address, number one, the humanitarian crisis, as well as to bolster and support the LAF while honoring that interest in not enabling a corrupt government?
Thank you, Rich. So it's kind of, I see this at almost three answers. And I don't want to talk too long because I hope that we're having a dialogue here, but it's humanitarian, LAF, and I would say long-term solutions. I mean, as I said in July to the leaders of Lebanon, to their face, if you don't move on the IMF staff agreement and start to bring about reforms in your country in the next 3 or 4 months, you're going to be presiding over what you have created as a beggar state. Nothing more than a beggar state. And of course, we've seen since July some movements on the IMF reform package. So long term, I think they need a reform agenda that's carrots and sticks. You get help, you get aid, but you must take incremental steps in order to get that aid incrementally. But if we're going to be that tough, as you say, Rich, a great question here, what are you going to do about the people of Lebanon? How do we support them in the meantime? How do we support the Lebanese Armed Forces, which is the only working institution in that country? Well, we can do it in a number of ways, and I think the international community understands that. One is food aid. Now that the poverty rate is over 80%, we're talking about, I don't know what percentage, probably a third of that 80% is starving, don't get enough food. So there's food aid. There's a welfare safety net program that's also going into effect with the help of UN agencies. The United States is the biggest contributor to the UN in this regard, having sent more than $700 million in aid last year. The LAF families have to be supported. With the downfall of the lira, as you all know, what a soldier used to make equivalent to $400 is less than $40 now a month. They can't live. So they're taking second jobs. And some of them who work like Monday through Thursday and get the weekend off, then go on jobs. Well, this is not good for the morale. It's not good for them. So we've got to have some kind of family aid program. Qatar stepped in. United States is now sending money through UNDP to be helpful to support this, the stability of the country through the LAF. The universities, my God, Lebanon was known for its education in the region, grade school, high school, college. We've educated so many regional leaders at AUB and LAU and NDU and St. Joseph's and other universities. I mean, we can support them. We can support civil society. And then lastly, I would say we can also support decentralizing services. And what I mean by that is if this government has truly failed, and it's close to failure, if it's truly failed, what are we going to do to answer your question, Rich? Maybe we got to start thinking about working with villages, solar energy, garbage collection, education, working with a governance structure with civil society, making sure that their mayor and their regional representatives are doing their job. There's so many things at the local level we can do as well. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for that. And Bishop Gregory, I know, no doubt, there's a role for the Catholic Church and the Maronite Church in the humanitarian question in Lebanon. I'd love to hear from you on that regard.
So what the ambassador said about civil society is so very important. From the LAF, proper decent salaries for them, to all of the teachers, to all of the NGOs, international and Lebanon's special NGOs, especially the Catholic. There are so many Catholic NGOs. There's Caritas Lebanon, there's St. Vincent de Paul Society, there's the hospitals, the universities, 321 Catholic schools, grade schools. So there's so many ways that we can help, and we are. Both Bishop Zaidan and myself, with the Maronite community, are working very closely with them. So, yeah, Lebanon has lived pretty much without a government, a functioning government, for the last maybe 7, 8, 10 years. Hezbollah blocked the formation of a government for a couple of years because they didn't have their veto power. So I do think that the Catholic NGOs are so very, very important. And that's something that the ambassador mentioned, villages. We have a man who just, for every little poor family in his village, he gave them solar energy. It cost him about $4,000 a home. And those kind of things make a huge difference for people. So,
Bishop, if I could add to that, one thing we forgot is health.
yeah,
The hospitals.
hospitals.
People from all over the world went to Lebanon for health. And now what do we got? What we've got is a country that was known for good health and education, failing in those two regards. So we've also got to be helpful with the health sector, with the hospital sector in that country as well.
Thank you, Ambassador, for remembering that. If I may say that, I know groups of sisters and priests and laypersons who are going into debt so that they can continue to serve the poor. They don't want their hospital or their school or their health facility to go bankrupt. So they're borrowing from everybody they can and asking everybody for donations. We've had bishops come here to be strengthened financially to go back to Lebanon to serve. So I think right now we really need to support those, especially the Catholic. Not just because I'm Catholic, but because Catholic institutions serve Muslims and Christians alike. That's something beautiful.
And another thing, Rich, not to belabor your question, but another thing is, where are the Gulf countries? Qatar did come through for the LAF, thank God. But the Gulfies should come through with this. They don't have to support a corrupt government. We don't want them to. They stand with the United States and carrying a tough stick with them to reform or else. But they can support hospitals. They can support education. They can support civil society. They can support the LAF. So we got to get the Gulf countries to realize that they should not cede soft power to Iran. That they've got to weigh in and show Lebanon that they too want to be helpful to the people of Lebanon.
Rich, if I can say a word about this, because I appreciate working with the ambassador because he does a lot of the practical political things, and I keep my hands off those kind of things. But I thank God that he's doing that.
Well, let me just say, I think what he's saying is I do the dirty work for him.
I was going to say that. Thank you very much. But I do want to say something that might be a little controversial, because Lebanon is in a tug of war. And the head of Hezbollah has gone publicly and said that Iran and China will bail out the Lebanese from their financial miseries if we just look to them. And the vast majority of the Lebanese are saying to themselves, we don't want to be slaves to anybody. And so that's the tug of war. Hezbollah is trying to push the country towards Iran and China. And the rest of the Lebanese are saying, no, we formed this country to be free. We don't need to be slaves to anybody.
And that brings us to a bigger question, Rich, and that is, what is America going to do in the world post-Russian war? And I think the bishop put his finger on it. There's a community of nations with like values. They don't sit in the UN Security Council. And so there's a question about how does America lead nations of like-minded values to make sure that we're doing the right thing in the world. And that's going to be, and we're going to be in competition, as the president says, with China. And we're not only in competition with them on military and trade. We're talking about hearts and minds. We're talking about soft power. Used to be that American education was the most important thing people would want to come to our country about. Now they can't get a visa. Our exchange programs need to be even increased at the State Department. These are things that we've got to do, and Lebanon's a microcosm of that. And the bishop really pointed to the point that this is really even larger than that when you consider what Russia's up to in China, and Syria and Lebanon in the region, and also what China's up to.
Thank you for that. Very interesting. In fact, it resonated with me particularly because it brought to mind the long story arc of Lebanon and its turbulence. Looking back to 1958 and the UAR and the Nasserites' influence in Lebanon and what they were trying to achieve in Lebanon. Fast forward to the 70s and 80s. Russian fingerprints all over the civil war in Lebanon during those decades. Then today, Iran and China seeking to find its foothold in Lebanon. The story arc is long and it's hard to listen to in some ways as a Westerner, and I can only imagine even tougher to have lived as a native Lebanese. With that, I'd like to just ask a question. Given that the philosophy, the founding philosophy of Lebanon that you spoke about, Bishop Mansour, also in light of the history of prosperity, at one time considered the Paris of the Middle East and the Switzerland of the Middle East for its role in finance in the region and in other areas of prosperity, but also taking into account its periods of turbulence and trial and war. What has this all done in its totality to the Lebanese people, for better and for worse? Certainly, there's a lot of bad that it's done for the Lebanese people, but there is some virtue and value in suffering in the Christian worldview. And I'd love to hear your comments on that, Bishop Gregory.
Well, let's look at August of 2020 after the explosion. Who did you see in the streets the next day? Young people, Muslims and Christians, St. Vincent de Paul, volunteers. You had old people and young people. And that's Lebanon. Khalil Gibran used to say, you have your Lebanon and I have mine. And for him, he made the point, your Lebanon, you take whatever you want, you want to control you. And my Lebanon is the Lebanon of the villager, the farmer, the young people, the student, the teacher, the civil servant. It's that Lebanon. Fuad al-Turk was a diplomat, and he said, "I love Lebanon so much. If Lebanon was a woman, I'd marry her." And that beautiful expression is there's still people who love that about Lebanon, and I think that's something we should never lose.
Ambassador Gabriel, given that story arc of Lebanon that we spoke about, the turbulent history, as well as the positives, the prosperity that we've seen in previous decades, what has this story arc done to the Lebanese people, for better and for worse?
So I agree with the bishop. The word that we don't like to hear anymore is resilience, but the reason why we continue to hear it is because Lebanese people continue to show their resilience. I mean, they're adjusting to this mess right now. You go through the streets of Beirut and you can see the poverty. You can see the pressure of the refugees. You can see the lights out. You can see the garbage piling up. But if you just go an hour outside of Beirut and you're in the mountains, you think you're in a different country. And the people are taking care of one another. So that's the good side. Let me just divert and also say there's a challenge, though, for the people of Lebanon not to give up. Remember the Yellow Jackets in France, their demonstrations? What happened? It's going to take a concerted, sustained effort by the Lebanese people to stick to it. Secondly, I think also, the good news is that Hezbollah and its allies lost the majority in the parliament in May by a slim margin. But those who won need to get together, stick together, and make sure that they see that they work for the betterment of the country, not for personal interest, or realize that sometimes you got to take a half a pie, not the full pie, when you're trying to move your country ahead incrementally. So I think that's important as well. My hope is that Bishop Mansour's view, which is very positive, is the one that wins. But I worry that people get tired and they give up, and then we have brain drain, and we have people who can leave wanting to leave. We've got to fix this before that happens.
Thank you very much for that. This is a conversation that's always fascinating, always urgent, and always challenging at the same time. So with that, I'd really like to thank you both for joining me today, Ambassador Gabriel for your tireless advocacy, and Bishop Gregory for your tireless leadership and example that you set for your community. Thank you both for joining me today.
Thank you, Rich. Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bishop.